No matter whether you're working as a front-end developer or a back-end developer, CORS is something which you should be aware of. And in this video, I'm going to explain you the overall concept of CORS and its implementation in a .NET Core ecosystem. So without wasting any further time, let's get started. First thing first, what do you mean by CORS? CORS stands for Cross Origin Resource Sharing. And in order to understand this in detail, we need to understand the meaning of term origin. What exactly is an origin? An origin is consisting of three parts. The first one is a scheme, then a domain, and finally a port number. Any website, any APIs that are running on a particular URL, and if they have a same scheme, same domain, and a same port number, then they belongs to a same origin. Let's take an example to understand its detail. Suppose I have hosted an API that runs on https slash my domain address is api server.com and it's running on a port number 1129, and then my real API endpoint is api slash orders, and my another API is running on https again api server.com again 1129, and then API then employee. My domain, which is api server.com, my scheme, which is https, and my port number 1129, they both are same in both the APIs. So we can simply say that they belongs to a same origin. Similarly, if I again write another example of an API, which simply says http slash api server.com, port number 1129, and then API, and then maybe product, and the third one belongs to a different origin, because you can see the first and second consist of a scheme as an HTTPS, but the third consists of a scheme name as HTTP. And in that case, it's not in the same origin. I hope this difference or this example makes you clear what belongs to a same origin and what exactly the origin is. Just to repeat it again, an origin is a combination of a scheme, domain, and port number. And all my endpoints, all my APIs that consist of these three things and as equal belongs to a same origin. Okay. It is a functionality of a browser to block the request that is coming from a different origin. So, for example, if my website is there, and let's assume my website it's running on a port number, let's say 8080, and on the same machine, if I'm running an API, and let's say it's run on port number 8081. In that case, if my website is trying to make a call to my API, and because they both have a different port number, that will be considered as a different origin, and by default, a browser will block this request. I just want to highlight one term over here, that CORS is not something which is prevented, which is applied on the server side. It is a by default functionality of a browser to block this request whenever it sees a request is coming from a one domain and going to a different domain. Let's take an example to understand this in a real world scenario. Let's suppose you are opening up a web browser, and on a web browser you have opened two different tabs. Now in my first tab I am running a social networking site, which is my facebook.com. In the second tab I'm running a PayPal site which is useful for payment processing. Now if a facebook.com, or I should say a JavaScript or maybe a script from facebook.com, tries to make a call to a paypal.com, this will be by default blocked. By default, a browser won't allow this request because browser sees that they are two different domain, and hence I am not going to allow you to make that request. Ideally, this should be blocked at the server level, but since a browser is also playing a role, so that is a security feature which blocks this request. Okay, and that is called as a same origin policy. But the question is, what exactly is CORS? Because we have not discussed CORS yet. What we have discussed so far is what about the origin is. CORS is a mechanism which allows a request from a particular domain. Now, take a same example. Let's say my APIs are running on port number 818081 and my UI is running on port number 8080, and somehow I want to make a communication because obviously my UI will be a separate one, my API will be a separate one, and I want to fetch data from my APIs. Then my server, my backend server, they need to enable this port number by default. Okay. So whenever I write an extra piece of code in my backend APIs, in my backend server, a backend server will send an extra header in the response, and that browser will read that header, and based on that header, it will allow to make a call to the server, and that policy is called as CORS policy, where we are simply saying that I am allowing a request, I am allowing a browser to share a resources from two different origin, and that is a cross origin. So I hope this definition is clear to you that cross origin resource sharing, or in short CORS, is a functionality, is a feature that allow me to call a backend APIs from a front end, and both of running a separate domain. Okay. One thing I want to highlight over here is a CORS is a typical browser feature. So for example, if you are making an API call which is running on 8081 port number, either from a .NET backend or maybe a Java backend, or maybe you want to run this API from a Postman, maybe any kind of an API testing tool, this CORS will not come into a picture because CORS is strictly a browser based functionality. This CORS will only come into a picture when you're trying to make a call from your web application, and to be more precise, from a front-end framework like Angular, React, or maybe Vue.js, because these frameworks typically relies on JavaScript to make a call to the server, and JavaScript is something which runs on a client side. Okay. In order to understand this in a little bit more detail, I have just created a demo, and let me just walk you through that bit. But first of all, let me just explain you what we are going to do. So our APIs are a .NET Core APIs. I have not done any major logic in order to implement those APIs. They are the bare minimum one. And this .NET Core APIs are consumed by two different frameworks or two different applications. The first application is my React application, which is my front end framework. And then a second application is my ASP.NET Core MVC application, which is technically my backend framework, which is used to develop a web application. And you will notice that the same API can be consumed easily by my ASP.NET MVC, whereas for my front end, like React application, it will start throwing a CORS issue. So let's check this in action. I'm going to show you the little bit code base of that bit. So this one is my .NET Core MVC application. Okay, it does nothing. It's just an MVC page which is relying on an API running on port number 7177. And if I further proceed with it, if I further check this bit, you can notice that my APIs are running on port number 7177. And this is again a weather forecast API, a default template that you will get while getting an API project. So nothing fancy about this one. Let's first check the response of an API. So I'll go to this particular website or particular address. You can see my website or my APIs are running on port number 7177. And if I refresh this, I'm technically getting a response, which means my APIs are functional. Now I'm trying to call the same APIs from my .NET Core MVC application, and the code base is something which you can see over here. So this is the place where I'm calling my APIs. See, I'm simply making an HTTP client object, a bare minimum stuff to call an API in .NET Core ecosystem. And then finally, I'm giving a port number. And based on that, I'm displaying a response back to my UI, back to my browser. And that's what is happening. So whatever my APIs are responding, like my APIs are giving me a temperature and these things, and the same stuff is over here. If I refresh it randomly every time, I'll get a different temperature because that's what my APIs are designed for. So APIs every time give me a random temperature, and every time my UI is calling my APIs and I'm getting a response back to it. So up to this point, everything is fine. You have noticed that whatever I am running from a backend, whatever my APIs gives to me, my front-end framework, which is my ASP.NET Core MVC, is able to call those APIs, and I'm not getting any kind of CORS exception, CORS issue, obviously, because as I told you that this policy will come into a picture when we make a call from a browser to an API. But applications or framework like ASP.NET Core MVC, they make a server-to-server call. So in that case, it is fine. But let's try to have the same implementation, the same thing in a React-based application. So I'll switch back to Visual Studio Code, and we have written a basic logic to create a React application. This React application consists of a file app.js, and inside this file, I am simply making an API call relying on the same port number. I have used couple of React hooks like useState and useEffect, and then once I receive an API response, I am setting this up into my variable. And finally, I am reading that variable value and iterating over there to display the content on my UI. Let's run this application and see what else we get. If I run this application with a command npm start, it will start building my code and it will open up a development server on port number 3000, and you'll notice I am getting an issue. This might not be clear to you, so let's open a network tab. I'll click on inspect element and I'll open a network tab. And in my network tab, if I again refresh my browser, you will see that I am getting an issue over there, and the error message is CORS error. If you further navigate to console window, you will notice in a detailed way that access to fetch at this API endpoint from origin has been blocked. Let's recall the concept of an origin again. Although my app is running on localhost, but here my scheme is different. My API scheme is HTTPS. My UI scheme is HTTP. My API port number is 7177. My UI port number is 3000. And because scheme and port number is different, it is considered as a different origin. And because that is a different origin, browser is not allowing me to make an API call. And that is all about a same origin policy. If I have to enable my browser, my React app, to make this call, I have to enable a CORS. And enabling a CORS can be done with couple of changes in my backend code base, which is my .NET Core application. But let's understand what do you mean by this particular header, which says access control allow origin. Let me copy this and search Google for the same thing. If I open my MDN documentation, you will notice that this header is the response header, which indicates whether the response can be shared with the requesting code from a given origin, right? So whenever you allow a course, whenever you make a relevant changes into your backend code base, the backend code send a specific header in the response, and the header name is access control allow origin. By seeing this header, browser will make a call to that particular remote URL. But how can we get this header back to my responses? There are a couple of ways using which you can get this header back to responses. Like, and you can simply go to your .NET Core application. Like if I again go to my .NET Core API project, which is this one, I can write a custom middleware to include this header into my responses. If you're not aware about custom middleware, then please click on the top right corner of this window. I have recorded an entire video explaining the concept of custom middleware. You can watch that as well. But there is no requirement of creating a custom middleware because .NET as a framework has already given us a mechanism to enable a CORS in my APIs. Let me show you how we can do that. First of all, I'll stop this application and then I'll go and add a middle over here. Middleware says builder.services.addCors. Okay, it's an inbuilt one. I have not downloaded any kind of NuGet package in my .NET Core APIs. It's an inbuilt middleware provided to me by the framework. Then inside this middleware, I need to define certain settings. So I'll define an options, and then inside an option, I'll define a policy. You can define multiple policy as per the CORS. Let's suppose you want to call your APIs to a different areas. You can define different policies. But I only want to call my API from my React based application. So I'll define a single policy over there. In this policy, again, I have to define some configuration. So I'll give the policy name first of all, and the policy name is, let's say, front end. And then in this policy name, I have to define multiple configurations. I'll define options, and inside an option, let's see what we can do. The first setting is options dot with origin. See, there are a couple of methods inside this option. It says allow any header, allow any method, allow origin, allow condition. Technically, if you allow this, allow any origin, then I am instructing my server that you should be giving a response to a request coming from an any origin. This is commonly done in a public APIs. But for all the other APIs, which is our internal ones, which will be only consumed by your front end, this should not be set to allow any origin. Rather, we have a different method, and that is with origin. Now, this with origins consists of a list of parameter. It consists of an array, and I can define multiple origins which I want to make this API call happen. As of now, I'm only going to define my front end URL, which is my HTTP localhost 3000. So I'm saying that as of now, only allow an API call from this, only allow a request from this origin, but this also supports multiple value, and I can provide a comma separate value over here as well. Okay. Then I also have to make sure what method I want to allow. Based on this origin, I am saying that allow any method. But if you want, you can even give a specific method to be allowed. I'm simply saying that whatever method that is requesting by this origin, please allow that. And I'm also saying that allow any header. You can again say that if you want to allow get, put, post API calls, maybe you only want to allow get, but I don't want to allow post. You can define those things over here. But I know that my React application will be doing all the major heavy lifting of work from a UI side, so I'm allowing everything. So I'll simply write it down, allow any header and allow any method. There are other methods as well, like allow any credentials, that will cover something sometime later, but this will also make a different CORS policy. So let's make the relevant changes. So I'm going in my builder.build section, and before registering my controllers, like this is a minimal API project, but before registering my controllers, I need to define this CORS policy. The best place is define on the top. I'll say app.UseCors and give the name, whatever the policy name that you have given on the top, and it's a front end. So I'll copy this name over here and I'll paste this front end at this location. Okay. So in this way, what I have done is I have simply enabled a policy, a CORS policy, and then I'm giving it, injecting into my .NET Core pipeline. Let's save all the changes, build this application. I'm simply doing .NET build first, and this .NET build will check my any kind of compile time issue, and then I'll run this API. So I'm going to use .NET Watch, which will be enabling a hot reload and then providing a launch profile as HTTPS. So now my API changes are completed. Let me run this API. It will be again up and running on port number 7177. Let's go to the browser. If I switch back to my browser, then and go to my React application, and let me refresh this. And you can see I'm getting a data back. But let's see what happened behind the scene. So if I go to my network tab, and again you can say that I am making an API call. Header, you can see I'm getting a specific tag which says access control allow origin, and the response which server is giving me is localhost 3000. So when I call an API, the server is giving me a response, my .NET Core server, that if a request is coming from a localhost 3000, then allow that request. Browser reads this header, and based on that header, it allows the request from this particular endpoint. Let me do a manual modification in my code base. I'll again jump to my API project, and in my API project, let me first change the port number to 3001. Let me save the changes. Let's close this and again do a .NET Watch. If I again navigate back to my browser and if I again refresh it, you will notice I am again getting a CORS issue. Why so? Because this time I am hitting my APIs, I am hitting my API from port number 3000, but my CORS policy says that it is only going to allow a request from port number 3001. You can actually combine both the port number, and this is quite normal because in a real API project, a API need to be consumed by different applications. So your app runs on dev environment, QA environment, maybe on production, and whatever the domain address of those environments are, you can simply put it down over here. You can also pick it up from a database if you want to configure it dynamically, maybe from app settings file. But these method supports multiple parameters, multiple port number. Let me save the changes and then again restart my application. And now you will notice that my this CORS policy will be allowing a request coming from two origins with a port number 3001 and 3000. If I again jump back to my browser and if I again refresh it back, you will notice that I'm again getting a data, and then in my data, in my response header, I still have this access control allow origin request header. Sorry, a response header. So this is clear that CORS is something which only is impacted by the browser application or browser based application. My .NET Core MVC application is still untouched. There is no point of confusion in this part, because in my .NET Core MVC I am making server to server call, and in that case CORS will not come into a picture. But all my front end based application, whether it's a React, whether it's an Angular, a typical JavaScript application, this will come into a picture and you have to define this policy. Moreover, from a best practices point of view, from a security concern, it is recommended that no matter whether you are creating a public APIs or maybe you are creating your own consumption based APIs, you should be having this kind of stuff in between, because this will give you additional security. Let's suppose that you allow a CORS with all the origins and your APIs are not a public API, then anyone over the internet would be able to make a call to your API servers. Obviously, you will implement some kind of authentication mechanism like token authentication or something else, but this is also required to add a middleware where I am rejecting the request upfront without even going further down to my line. This is it for this video, guys. I hope you understood the concept of a course. If you do have any questions, then please mention in the comment section. Additionally, please like, share, subscribe to my channel. This will keep me motivated to record a new content for you. Thank you.